the two stragglers, Cretes and Arabians. We do hear them speak in our tongues the wonderful works of God. And they were all amazed and were in doubt, saying one to another, What meaneth this? And others, mocking, said, These men are full of new wine. Who are the men? Back up in verse 5, if you'll let your eyes run back up there. Are they really diaspora pilgrims who've traveled to Jerusalem in order to keep the Feast of Pentecost? That's the traditional, historic interpretation. Conservatives, non-conservatives, everybody. I'm not convinced that that's true. Let's give you just a brief review to start off with, set the scene of what's going on here in Acts 2. Verses 1 to 4. We'll divide that part of the chapter we need up into 3 sections. Verses 1 to 4. At this point, we're 50 days after Passover and crucifixion. We know that. We know that from the Jewish calendar. We're 50 days after Passover and the crucifixion. We're probably about 10 days after Jesus' ascension, recorded in Acts 1. We know that from the Old Testament. And either the 11 plus 1 apostles, original 11 plus Matthias, or 120 of his disciples, 12 of those being those apostles, most, if not all, from Galilee, according to verse 7, have just been baptized in the Holy Spirit. That's the essence of verses 1 to 4. Some people, followers of Jesus, either the apostles or the apostles and others, 120. Most from Galilee, if not all, have just been baptized in the Holy Spirit. Then in verses 5 through 13, Luke tells us about some of the people who were present during Pentecost. And he records 2 responses to this occurrence of the infilling of the Holy Spirit. He records 2 responses. The first is one of amazement and questioning, found in verse 12, seen as follows, And they were all amazed, one of amazement, and were in doubt, saying one to another, What meaneth this? And questioning. The first response is one of amazement and questioning. The second, a pejorative one, in verse 13, is ridicule and jibe. J-I-B-E. So he gives us some of the people through this long list talking about Jews and all these other little names that we find here in verses 5 and 9 through 11. 9 through 11a, really. And then we've got evidently somehow 2 different groups of people, whether they can be clearly, distinguished. By that I would mean like verse 9, the Parthians, Medes, down through those in Asia would be a correspondent to verse 12, the people who simply were amazed and questioned, and the rest of the people corresponding to verse 13, the ones filled with ridicule and jibes. That's debatable, whether you can really divide it up in any way like that. But Luke does tell us that we have 2 different responses, 2 different reactions from the people around there. One is amazement and questioning, and the other is ridicule. Okay. Then, verses 14 through 36, our third division. And then we don't need to go past that. Verses 14 through 36. Here, Luke gives us Peter's sermon. Peter first addresses the jibe, singularly dismissing it with a reference to the time of day in verse 15. And then he launches into a sustained explanation of, quote, what meaneth this, unquote, specifically in verses 16 through 21. This all prepares the way for Peter's sermon. So let me give that to you again. Peter first of all addresses the jibe these men are full of new wine, singularly dismissing it with a reference to the time of day. How could these men be drunk, seeing it's but the third hour of the day, 9 o'clock in the morning? It would be unlikely that that any Jewish person would be drunk by this time of the day, especially on a holy day. This is Pentecost. You might not break your fast until later in the day. Breakfast would probably be later in the day, and no one would be drunk by 9 o'clock in the morning. You'd have to come to America for that. Then, after verse 15, he launches into a sustained explanation of the question, what meaneth this? In other words, Peter, this business of, these men are drunk, he just dismisses that with a reference to the time of day. I mean, that's so pejorative, it's so nonsensical that he doesn't even really give it anything but the time of day. But then these people who are questioning what meaneth this, he sees more sincerity in that. And so he launches into a rather sustained explanation, an answer to that question. What does this mean? He said, all right, I'll tell you what this means. This is that was spoken by the prophet Joel. He thinks evidently these people are deserving enough of an answer for him to give them one. And that's verses 16 through 21. And then all of this is then followed by a regular preaching of the gospel before we return to the onlookers again, which would be verse 37. That's why I stopped with 36. You have to look down at your Bible and follow along here. When they heard this, so he must be in verse 37 talking about some of these onlookers. And since they're pricked in heart and they end up converted, I would doubt that would be the group of verse 13, the mocking ones. It'd probably be the group of verse 12, or at least some of that group, who asked the question genuinely, what does this mean? Notice they didn't just say, well, this is nonsense or something. They were amazed, but they did ask the question, what does it mean? Peter says, all right, here's what it means, and he convinces the people in our earliest account of a Christian sermon. Now, let's jump. That sets the scene. We've got more time left, so let's jump back into verse 5. There were dwelling at Jerusalem Jews, devout men out of every nation under heaven, or as the NIV said, now there were staying in Jerusalem God-fearing Jews from every nation under heaven. And we'll have to look at both of those translations. The basic question here that we would have to ask is, who are these Jerusalemites? Who are the men of verse 5? Well, I think we will find there are three suggestions, and really only three. We'll look at A and we'll look at B tonight. We will save C for next time. Who are the Jerusalemites in verse 5? Well, the first solution that's been proposed is this. They are Gentiles. Now, what problem do you see with that suggestion? Pardon? All right, they're not Jews. The verse said there were dwelling in Jerusalem Jews, devout men out of every nation under heaven. Or NIV, they were staying at Jerusalem, God-fearing Jews from every nation under heaven. Well, one of our important early ancient manuscripts, Codex Aleph, lacks the term Jews in verse 5. Now, doesn't that turn the whole situation around then into a whole new ball game here? This would make some sense. We got still several solutions or suggestions under A, but this would make sense. Now there were dwelling at Jerusalem devout men out of every nation under heaven. And if it doesn't say what type of men they are, and it goes on to list these places from whence they've come, we would know what we're talking about here would obviously be Gentiles. Now follow along with me carefully. The rest of the way through Acts as we study this is going to be very technical sometimes. We'll be staying right with Acts, though. We will not be getting into rabbinical material. There were dwelling at Jerusalem devout men out of every nation under heaven. Now, we've got one famous codex here that leaves Jews out. Now, I'll show you why, even if we don't believe that codex, there's some sense could be made of this. I'll read it to you one more time. There were dwelling at Jerusalem devout men. Let's paraphrase. There were dwelling at Jerusalem devout Gentiles out of every nation under heaven. All right, now look down into verse 10. That then would make sense of this appearance of Jews in verse 10. I mean, if these are Jews dwelling in Jerusalem, then why, when we go through this list, then Luke says there were Jews? I mean, that's obvious. I wouldn't think that we're talking about nationalities or something. That would be obvious that there would be Jews. But then again, we have some other problems with that. Some people have suggested that what we have here is a reference to just pure pagans. I mean, pagans purely and simply so, who are simply, well, you'll find different suggestions as to why they're at Jerusalem. Some say, well, they're curious onlookers. They know that this is, a monotheistic faith, and this is a holy day, and so they're in Jerusalem for this purpose. That's kind of far-fetched. Other people say they're here on business matters, that there was a lot of commerce and travel that took place in the first century in this part of the world. And so Gentiles are here in Jerusalem, pure pagans, purely and simply pagans, are here for business purposes, and they end up, being converted here and take the gospel back to their homelands whenever they leave. Other people have said, no, what Luke is talking about in calling them Gentiles here is he's talking about proselytes of the gate. Here we've got people who are interested in Judaism. They're not here just for business matters here. They're truly interested in the Jewish faith. And that's why they're here on the day of Pentecost. And they end up getting Judaism and then some. It's fulfillment, Christianity. Well, that will not make a whole lot of sense, as we'll see later on, because if Luke wants to refer to those people, he has some other terms that he uses later on in the book of Acts, and one of those terms is not found here. Or then another suggestion has been, all right, it's Gentiles, they're not just purely pagan, and they're not proselytes of the gate, they're proselytes of righteousness. These are proselytes of righteousness. They've been converted by Jewish synagogues in the far-flung Roman Empire. And being faithful to their conversion experience on an important annual feast day like Pentecost, they make the trip, the sacred pilgrimage and journey to Jerusalem. Well, if these are those proselytes, then why are proselytes mentioned later in verse 10, though? That wouldn't make any sense. That would just be repeating yourself. And besides that, unless this is the only exception, every time the New Testament intends for us to know they're talking about proselytes, they use the term proselyte. They never use anything else but proselyte. If it's a full, regular proselyte, that's the only thing that they use. They would never just call them Jerusalemites, devout men. So you can add up here, your proselytes of gate and of righteousness. Now, this is the only manuscript that we have to support this, so that's probably not enough evidence to drop the word Jews here. And here seems to be the concluding proof that we shouldn't follow Aleph with dropping Jews and assuming that Luke has reference to Gentiles, and that is because of the adjective that he uses here, eulaphes. Eulaphes, translated in the KJV as devout, translated perhaps a little bit disappointingly so in the NIV as God-fearing. Now I say disappointingly because I think that translating it that way, which is the only time the NIV translates eulaphes with God-fearing, is going to bring into our study unnecessary problems later on. I think that's an unfortunate translation. Most of the time the NIV stays with devout. I think one other time it uses another word. but it never uses the word God-fearing to translate eulathais except here in Acts 2 and verse 5. I think that's a very unfortunate translation. All right, let's go back. You say, well, what's important about this adjective? These Jerusalem, whoever they are, Jews or Gentiles, they are eulathais men. They are devout men. All right, let's look and see how Luke uses eulathais then. He used it as an adjective to describe some people. What type of people does he use it to describe? It is only used by Luke, unless this passage is the only exception, it is only used by Luke to describe Jews. It is only an adjective used to describe Jews. And we're going to come back to this adjective and its appearance here later on. It's going to be important. It's going to show you something else that you might have a false belief about over in Acts chapter 8, and I think around verse 2. Okay, here are the other references in Luke's writings. Luke's Gospel, and by the way, KJV here, thankfully, it's consistent, always translates the word as devout, and that's probably a good translation. Luke 2:25, once in his Gospel here, in referring to Simeon, Luke 2:25. Behold, there was a man in Jerusalem whose name was Simeon. The same man was just and eulathais. He was devout. And what was Simeon? A Gentile? No, he's a Jew. In Acts 22:12, Luke has this word, I believe, on the lips of Paul, when Paul is speaking of Ananias, that man under whom he was healed and baptized in Acts 9. Acts 22:12, one Ananias, a devout man according to the law. See the word devout again? It's eulathais, and he's a Jewish man. And then, as I said, Acts 8:2. And devout men carried Stephen to his burial and made great lamentation over him. We'll come to that verse later on in our study and see what we can learn from that small little interesting verse. Acts 8:2. Devout men. But as we'll have to show you in that study, we can't do that right now. Those were Jewish people. Those were Jewish men and not Gentiles. And besides that, we just don't have enough manuscript evidence to support Gentiles. All right, so we strike A out then. A is really not an alternative. These men are Jewish men. They were dwelling at Jerusalem, Jews, devout men out of every nation under heaven. And let's keep it devout. Let's don't call them God-fearing as the NIV does. That's a very unfortunate translation. I don't really know why the NIV does that. It doesn't do it anywhere else that I know of. Not for that word. And that's going to introduce unnecessary problems for us later on. Then a second suggestion, which is the historic one in the church, is that these Jews are what I might call Pentecost pilgrims. Jewish Pentecost pilgrims. There are diaspora Jews born and living in the diaspora. They have come back to Jerusalem to worship, to celebrate the Feast of Pentecost. That's the most common view. It's a view that I'm sure I've said several times because it was the view that I held at one time. And my change of opinion is not an original change. I've come across another alternative in my readings that I'm firmly convinced of. But Pentecost pilgrims, this is the most common view, the one that appears, I think, first on the surface whenever you read it. It's just the first alternative, the first notion that pops in your mind. Well, these are Jews. When it goes on and lists all those nations, we know that they're not, native Jews. They come from all over the world. And that's the whole story of the great diaspora here. And they're back, faithful Jews, devout men, Luke calls them. They're finally back here in Jerusalem to celebrate the Feast of Pentecost. And what's going to happen but that they're going to hear the gospel and then take the gospel back home to them. And that's how Christianity spread into all those parts of the empire. Well, it may be the view that appears first on the surface, but not without problems with further study, though. That they are not native to Israel or to Jerusalem is certain. Whatever alternative or opinion we're going to opt for, that they are not native is certain. Why? They're described as, into verse 5, men from every nation under heaven. That proves they're not native Jerusalemites or Israelites. They're not native born. That's what I mean by native. They're not native born. They are diaspora Jews. But that this cannot be the right interpretation of the passage is evident from the following 4 points. Number 1, this will be difficult to prove now, but I can do it later on. It is unlikely that Luke wants or intends such a plain reference to the far-flung evangelism of the church predicted by Jesus in Acts 1:8 this early in his book. It is unlikely that Luke wants or intends such a plain reference to the far-flung evangelism of the church predicted in Acts 1:8. Jesus, remember what he said? You'll be witnesses to me in Jerusalem and in Judea and in Samaria and unto the uttermost part of the earth. And we see Acts kind of unfolding itself after the Acts 1:8 pattern. And uttermost part of the earth, that's very similar to Acts 2:5b, men from every nation under heaven. Uttermost part of the earth, though, is the conclusion, the end of Acts 1:8. That is the goal to which early Christianity is headed. I would argue it is highly unlikely, I'm definite positive of this, that Luke would want such a plain reference to the far-flung evangelism of the church to appear so early in his book. It's too obvious, and it's too plain of a reference. That he saves for later. But let me leave you with this sentence, though, on our first point. That these men did come from faraway lands is enough of a brief hint. It's another thing when we say that then they went back to those far lands and took the gospel with them. There's the far-flung evangelism of the church that I don't think Luke intends to imply this early in the narrative of Acts. But we know they are men from all parts of the empire. They're not native-born Jews. They're from all other diaspora Jews. That we know. So my last sentence again. That these men did come from faraway lands is enough of a brief hint. Have I lost any of you anywhere? Do I need to go over anything? Okay, this is very important now. Typical view is Pentecost pilgrims, and they've come from all over the world, from Parthian, Mesopotamia, and Rome, and they're here in Jerusalem, and they think that they're going to celebrate the Feast of Pentecost, and they get saved and baptized, and then they end up going back to their homelands and carrying the gospel with them. That's too early. It's too early for that in Acts. Acts is a story trying to tell us something, but we're reading the end of the book in the 2nd chapter, though. It's not going to be until 28 that we're in Rome. But yet Rome is mentioned in chapter 2. That it is mentioned is enough of a hint of where the book is going, is what I'm saying. But then to read into that they went back at this time, these people, and spread the gospel among, their native lands, these lands in which they were born, I think is extremely premature. Okay, a second point. Diaspora Jews who were here only temporarily would probably know little, if anything, about these 12 or 120 and their origin being Galilee. Verse 7. What do these men say? They were all amazed and marveled, saying one to another, Behold, are not all these which speak Galileans? How would Pentecost pilgrims know that? They've only been there a day or two. Or we could jump into 50 days. We'll discuss that option later on. How would they know the birthplace of these? Let's say that they're apostles here. I believe that it's more than apostles, but let's stay with the apostles. How would they know the birthplace of the apostles? I mean, they're not into current events, what's going on in Israel. They're just there because it's Pentecost, but they come from faraway lands. How in the world would they know these men are Galileans? Say, well, it's like Peter, thy speech bewrayeth thee. Yes, but they're speaking perfect in the perfect tongue of these men in the lands in which they were born. They're not speaking Hebrew or Aramaic that might could give them away, because the Galileans with their shibboleths did have an accent that the people in Jerusalem didn't have. That wouldn't even enter into the picture here. So verse 7 is another clincher. Verse 1 is a clincher to me. Or excuse me, the first point I gave you is a clincher to me. Second point is a clincher as well. They wouldn't know anything about Galilee. Number 3. Luke's use in verse 5 of dwelling at Jerusalem. So we're going to give you 4 points here. His use of dwelling at Jerusalem in verse 5 tends to preclude Pentecostal pilgrims, although this argument's not airtight. Now here again I would beg to differ with NIV. What does the NIV have there? Anyone got your NIV open? Yeah. Verse 5?
No, they were staying.
They were staying. That sounds like people who are just temporarily there, right? You know, someone visits you and from out of town you say, where are you staying tonight? Oh, we're staying down the road. You know, at such and such motel. Where are you staying? That's temporary residence. Dwelling, that implies some type of permanence. So which is right? KJV or NIV? Well, the KJV is right. This word in the Greek is a participle. Greek, as I've told you before, is filled with participles that simply cannot or do not translate into English. But a participle, in other words, would be this. This is what the Greek says. The dwelling ones. It doesn't say that people were dwelling. It says the dwelling ones. That's a participle. Participles just don't go over very well in English. The dwelling ones. Which this Greek term usually, it doesn't always, it's not an airtight argument, but usually implies long-term residence. Notice it's found in verse 14 again. Peter addresses them, all ye that dwell at Jerusalem. Now here's what makes it almost airtight to me. Luke has another participle if he wants to imply temporary residence. And guess what? He uses it, of all things, it's used right in verse 10, and it's translated strangers in the KJV. Literally, what does the participle mean there? The visiting ones. See what I'm saying? He's got a participle that implies short-term residence. He could have used this in verse 5. He could have said, those visiting Jews who are from every nation under. He doesn't call them the visiting Jews. He calls them the dwelling ones. Now, it's not an airtight case because sometimes this dwelling word is used for temporary residence. But here in this passage, since both of the words appear, Luke is trying to show some, I would argue, trying to show some difference between different groups of people here. We've got the temporary ones with this participle, the visiting ones. And what does the NIV call them? Visitors? Probably doesn't call them strangers. In probably verse 11, or is it in verse 10? Strangers of Rome, Jews and proselytes.
Well, Jews and converts to Judaism.
Visitors. Okay, visitors. Yeah, that's what I would think it would say, the visiting ones. Well, he didn't say that, though. So when NIV has staying in verse 5, I think that's a mistranslation. You may want to note this for your NIV. Either correct it now or take a note of it and correct it later. That's a different participle. These are dwelling ones. Or I think a better word, dwells, an old term. We don't say, where dost thou dwell? We say, where do you live? There were living. That's the way I think that in contemporary English we would translate verse 5. There were living at Jerusalem. These men weren't dwelling there like cliff dwellers or barn swallows or something. But these were men who were living there. And then finally tonight, a fourth point, verse 22. Start of Peter's sermon also seems to preclude this Pentecost pilgrim option. Ye men of Israel, hear these words. Jesus of Nazareth, a man approved of God among you by miracles and wonders and signs, which God did by him in the midst of you. Now watch this, as ye yourselves also know. Would Pentecost pilgrims who just pop in once a year be familiar with all these things about the life of Christ? Some argue that these pilgrims actually would have come for Passover and remained until Pentecost. So you can get two birds with one stone here, two feasts with one trip. Well, that may well be, that probably is. Come for Passover and stay a couple of months and get in Pentecost as well. But they could not have known anything about his miracles in earthly life. You see, if they came for Passover and they are Pentecost pilgrims, they would have been there when Jesus was crucified. They could know something about his death. But that's not what Peter starts off saying. Which God approved among you by miracles and wonders and signs, which God did by him in the midst of you, as you yourselves also know. 3 times you yourselves is emphasized there. If he's addressing Pentecost pilgrims who just got in 2 months ago from Rome, how could he accuse them of knowing all about the miracles in the earthly life of Christ? They would know nothing about that.